Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to have you join us on Zoom for this interesting conversation, which is about our exhibition, which is aptly called Bad Manners. So I hope you'll enjoy today's conversation. It's just for those who perhaps know our gallery a little bit less well. We are doing exhibitions which are really coming out of things we're interested in, works of art that interest us, artists who interest us, movements or concepts or things that challenge us and that we feel need to be explored further. So we are a secondary market gallery, but we follow the artists around us like Jake, who make us think, and we bring things together. So I hope you'll enjoy today's conversation.
So this exhibition, just to say one more word before we pass on the microphone to Jake and Massimiliano, is a show that kind of emerged a few years back from a conversation we held on the occasion of another show between Francesco Bonami and Jake Chapman, who kind of found a very good and common language with the gallery, with what we were doing at the time. And we've kind of kept a channel going and waiting for the right moment to do something together. And suddenly, I think that conversation developed into asking what kind of collaboration can happen between a gallery such as Luxembourg & Co. and an artist such as Jake. And it became an interesting question arose because Jake's practice has been together with Dinos and on his own for a long time, very much invested in the question of using other artists or other people's kind of artifacts and artworks, often without their permission and in ways that are very, very subversive. And what came out to be an interesting question is to try and look at a history that relates to that practice. And I think Jake has a very interesting argument, which he will unfold here, about what he thinks the role of these kinds of practices that engage with other people's work in a way that doesn't necessarily rely on their consent, or sometimes in the opposite way, actually kind of challenge the question of consent or authorship. So hopefully that will be the key question tonight. Massimiliano himself, as a curator who works with a kind of very strong signature voice, is often faced with the question of what he does with other artists' work. So that became very clear to us would be a really, really interesting conversation to make, not to mention previous projects in which he also kind of challenged the way we understand authorship and identity in the art world. So I pass on the microphone to you two. I'll start with asking, maybe though, Jake, I'll put on some images from the show for those who didn't see the show or haven't been to the gallery yet. But hopefully Jake can kind of take us through a little bit how and what the exhibition is about.
Okay, this is going to be a non-specific explanation of the origins of the show. I'm not going to kind of talk through the work, but I guess that in terms of our early conversations, we were discussing, what is the notion of making art? What are the claims for identity and for who can be claimed to make the work and who the work is for? I suppose that certainly for me, the 30 years of 30 years of working with my brother, the point and the purpose of working with two people is to, I suppose, disparage the notion that working as an artist, it refers to the idea of making some kind of internal sort of ego made manifest in the world. And that the question of two people making art raises the question as to the validity of the work they make, given that if, I guess in sort of classical senses or conventional senses of what a work of art means, that the work of art is treated as though it's the confessional trace element of some kind of internal reflection. Whereas if you have two people making art, or two or more, then somehow that product, that object, that thing is in some senses disingenuous because it cannot be ratified by a single ego. And so when you then kind of expand this model in thinking about what it is to be an artist. And you kind of, I suppose that you think about how this notion of artistic progress in terms of modernity, for example, occurs. One has a kind of an estimation of the idea of the sequence of art production being somehow a seamless transition from one work of art to another. And somehow that seemed to me not to actually, to not really explain really the process, and that process itself may not be so seamless. It might actually be more friction, might be more concerned with friction. I guess in some senses, the idea of saying, that I guess the idea of bad manners, exaggerates this process by which the relation between the art history is not such a friendly transition from ideas, that actually that process in itself can be kind of creatively destructive rather than sort of progressively enlightened, in a sense. I mean, that's a kind of a very bad overview, but that's kind of about it.
And can I ask something? I mean, maybe to put forward a concrete example. Something that happened in the conversation towards the exhibition is that we came across two works, one of which is probably one of your latest works, and the other one is a work from the 19th century by Manet. It was a kind of a chance encounter that doesn't happen very often, because on your studio wall was a version, an etching, an original lifetime etching of Olympia by Manet, which you couldn't help yourself but overpaint with watercolors. And we kind of had access or a connection to see the original drawing that led to that etching, but that kind of moment between the two works, or that space between the two works, for you, I think, symbolized something of a framework of a history. Maybe you can say something about that history.
Yeah, I mean, again, I suppose from the general, I suppose the point of view of thinking that that art is just. I mean, I guess it goes back to the kind of one of my favorite sort of phrases, that are saying that Shulamith Firestone suggests that, she says that modern art is a retaliation against bourgeois patronage. And so in that sense, it rather than seeing modern art as being some kind of progressive sort of sequence of sort of friendly objects which emerge in some evolutionary sort of, friendly way, the idea of seeing a work of art, the progression of works of art as being obliterative, so that a work of art doesn't sort of just emerge from some kind of congenial evolution. It emerges through the obliteration of the last. The very kind of basic tenet of the avant-garde is to obliterate the previous incarnation of art. So I suppose that just having a Manet anywhere near me and kind of artistic sort of materials like paints is going to be kind of catastrophic. But I guess the idea of sort of saying that the idea of drawing on someone's work or kind of obliterating their work is a way of actually not only denying that the work has a sovereignty that has to be kind of recognized, but also that one's own practice has no sovereignty. It becomes a way of demonstrating that how I view my own practice, my own activity, is not as a means of actually kind of prioritizing mine over Manet's, but it's a way of actually integrating both in a kind of a certain kind of, I suppose, a kind of an undecidable mire, rather than it being, so, and I guess in some senses that, I guess optimistically, I guess in some discursive way, the collision between two artists' work when one obliterates the other seems to me to be much more productive in terms of its outcome, rather than just a sequential progressive emergence. I mean, I guess in some senses, the very question, why have you obliterated someone else's work, is to me a more discursively vital question. And I suppose that kind of draws me to the idea of saying, well, it kind of, it antagonizes the notion that art is a kind of creatively positivistic activity. Again, for me, there are kind of questions of transgression and sort of relative nihilism, which are completely imminent to the idea of modernity. And that's for me the way in which you can kind of, I suppose, optimize this question and kind of maybe draw out some kind of awkward problem of the work of art. The problem of the modern work of art is that you know, by kind of maybe transgressing the boundaries of the notion of the sovereign artist, you know, the question is, well, actually, well, you know, who is the artist? Where are the boundaries? Where are the thresholds between which work of art starts? And also to kind of relieve the work of art from the proprietorial possession of the artist, so that the work of art is, once it's kind of obliterated by two people, so the kind of collaboration or the collision between me and Manet, the work of art has to be regarded as the thing in itself rather than being the possession, the intellectual or the creative possession of either of us. So it becomes a kind of a third object with two sort of maybe orphaned authors, you know, that it's no longer Manet's, it's no longer mine, and now it becomes an object that has to be regarded in and for itself in a truly Kantian sense.
Well, I suppose the difficulty with that question is obviously whether you know, history is full of examples of people doing that by symbolic manners and not physically touching or tampering with other people's artworks, to which, before you answer, I'm actually hoping that maybe Massimiliano you can tell us something about, because I find that the curatorial practice in a way has changed its face very much throughout the last century and came into a place where it often interferes a lot more with the context, the kind of the conditions of display of artwork. The curator has taken a different role. And I think that might be kind of possibly the softer, maybe not, version of what Jake is doing. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think, first of all, hi, everybody, and thank you for being here. As I said earlier, I won't take it personally that you invite me to be on a panel called Bad Manners. You had to cross the pond to find a perfectly impolite person that would join on this occasion.
Jake's taking too much space in this side of the pond. Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but it's so nice to be there virtually. I think the question you raise is certainly within, let's say, the art world or the industry, there has been a recognition of curatorial work as a form of authorship, about which I have some mixed feelings myself. But I think that's what has happened, and that has resulted in maybe a kind of dramaturgy that presses on the work in more explicit ways than a supposedly more neutral approach to exhibition making would be. I think personally, for what my experience is worth, it's a question that as a curator you have to pose to yourself, where does your work end and where does the artwork begins. I often find inspiration in the work of Umberto Eco around interpretation of texts, and among the many great books he wrote, there is one in English known as The Limits of Interpretation, and that has always been quite a fascinating book for me to understand. If we think of the artwork as a text, which may or may not be the right way to go about it, for Eco, the text he describes it beautifully. He says it's a lazy machine that needs the viewer to activate itself, but unlike the constructionist, he firmly believed that the work delineates some kind of borders around itself that allow you as a viewer or as a reader or as an interpreter to do certain things, but not others. And as a curator, I think my role is, in a sense, to inhabit those borders, maybe to push against them more or less gently, but I also have to be aware of where I should stop before the artwork becomes something else. Eco distinguishes between interpretation and use. And, he writes about use of books that can obviously lead to tragic consequences, like the books of Zion and the Holocaust. When you use something beyond what the text itself is allowing, you can lead to very tragic consequences. I think the artist, and this is something I've also learned from working with artists in curatorial roles, mainly, with Maurizio Cattelan, with whom we have done many shows, but also through the curatorial work of artists like Robert Gober or Jeremy Deller or Mike Kelly or Rosemary Trokel. I think the artist, for better or for worse, is granted an independence and an ability to use the work without being responsible for it. As a curator, I think you can be creative, but I think you still need to be aware of where the work asks you to stop. I mean, most clearly, if as a curator I were to intervene on a work, I would probably be kicked out of the artwork. I can have creative ideas. I think, there was a beautiful show many years ago called Radically Different, in which I believe there was a Donald Judd hung on a Andy Warhol wallpaper. So as a curator, would I be able to do that? Am I using Donald Judd to an extent that the work itself doesn't allow? And, now I'm drifting in because we are here speaking in a gallery on the occasion of a show. It's also interesting to see how there are rules and regulations that, the gallery, the estate, the agent are all delineating the borders of interpretation and use, and some are a little more interventionist than others. We have all worked with estates where you have to ask for permission even if you want to write a text, and I think that becomes also a bit of a battle that as a curator you have to fight, because I think your role is to allow for of interpretation to be performed and experienced to the furthest extent of freedom, but obviously freedom is a relative term, and it's imposed also politically and not just aesthetically. So I think that's maybe, to summarize all this, I think I look to artists working as curators because they can get away with crossing the limits of interpretation.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I'm going to take a work from the exhibition. I'm even going to maybe share the screen so everybody can see it to some extent. So there are actually three great works here, as you can see on the screen. The left one, sorry, they're moving. The left one is done by Martin Kiepenberger, but it is actually a great painting by Gerhard Richter, an artist that Kiepenberger both kind of adored and also felt very competitive towards, was a slightly older generation. And in the 80s, he goes on and buys this painting for himself and transforms it into a coffee table sculpture by Martin Kiepenberger. And by way of doing this, he also loses a lot of money because he buys it and then sells it as a Kiepenberger, and the question of value enters into here. But I guess what I want to ask about this is because if Kiepenberger is even less of an anomaly, but Jake, most of the works, that were gathered in the exhibition are actually works by artists who normally perform their practice in a way that is not reliant on the intervention in other artists' works. And for them, a lot of these gestures, we also see in the background this beautiful collage by Alp, which is again done in 1947, a few years after Sophie Tauber passes away, and he tears a drawing that's attributed to her or to her and him, and makes his own composition from it in a way that seems at once maybe touching and commemorative, but at the same time also hugely destructive and perhaps even, very aggressive considering his reputation compared to hers at the time. But I guess my question is, your practice is hugely different because these are not anomalies. These are not cases decided to take somebody's work. This is a systematic method. And I wonder whether you could say something about that and what that means to your practice.
I mean, I kind of would say that in some ways that, I think that it's a condition of modernity that the artist subtracts themselves from the crime of creativity per se. That's kind of pretty much the double take of being a modern artist. Means to say that what's being presented is a set of things which are tenuous by their very existential nature, tenuous enough to make it impossible for the artist to make any kind of complete claims about what the thing is, how it means, and how that whether that thing can be completely exchanged and translated in terms of its relationship between the viewer. So, it's a condition of modernity that it has this kind of inbuilt sort of sense of extreme self-doubt and precariousness in terms of how it distributes and how it produces meaning. So even in all of the artists that we have in the exhibition, in their individual practices, their individual practices are with the same kind of internal sort of self-doubt and kind of a tendency to be attracted to collapse rather than sort of some kind of dignified sense of self-importance. So I guess if anything that my work and the past sort of 3 decades of kind of parasitically kind of sort of stealing and kidnapping other people's work is just merely perhaps maybe to in some kind of melodramatic way to overemphasize what's already there. The sense in which that Goya, you're drawing on Goya, it seems not a kind, it doesn't seem to be a kind of a collision which is not already, that there's the drawing on Goya is already a kind of a sort of an enmeshment, which again, I think again, this notion of saying that it's not. I mean, I don't think that any artist that I've kind of been attracted to working on, it sounds ridiculous to say that, is an artist that can be seen as being someone who has a kind of a unified sense of what their relationship to their work is. So in a sense, drawing on Goya has never really been about Goya. I have no interest in Goya the person. I only have interested in the materiality of the work. And as you say, the textuality of it, or the work as the text, the work as not just the work, but the work as the theoretical and the institutional framework that the work exists in the historical kind of circumstance that we find ourselves in reading the work. So I kind of think that if anything, we've tried to, in our mine and Dinos's collaborations, we've tried to kind of exemplify that, maybe kind of switch it up to volume 11 rather than 9. But I think inherently, in terms of modernity, this is already the conditions of making modern art. Contorted chair frame and a table made out of painting. They are. The modernity sort of exemplifies its own self-undermining as a condition of its own intelligence in some ways, and that's kind of we've said this before in earlier conversations. When you think about kind of the relationship between technology and art, technology has a kind of a provable feedback loop in which it appears to, for all intents and purposes, to modify itself towards some kind of complexification. The thing about modern art is that once you depose Caravaggio's paintings, which are so optical, they reach the apex of what opticality can be in a flat surface. Then you end up with this kind of fast spiraling downward, in which the work of art itself has to depose its own means, as a routine, as a fundamental sort of requirement, that a work of modern art has to undermine its own process in order for it to attain its meaning, and this is kind of almost, it's kind of like a Brechtian kind of self-crippling in some ways.
You mentioned something about the kind of the almost, it sounds as if, Goya has almost found himself by mistake implicated in your practice. And yet when you look at the series of people you've chosen to work against, towards, within, from whether it's Goya, whether it's these early watercolors that Adolf Hitler makes when he's experimenting and thinking he might become an artist, or there is clearly some interest in destruction, in a very particular theme and subjects.
I mean, I think that on both counts, the use of Goya is actually more specifically the disasters of war, which are the kind of a very specific sort of set of works, not least because there are kind of claims and counterclaims about whether Goya made these etchings in relation to seeing these events. And actually, the idea that he didn't see these events makes those works even more interesting, because in some senses they could be, their kind of authenticity is in doubt in some ways. Although then, but the idea of saying, well, why disaster of war? Well, because they're the kind of they exemplify the kind of the departure of art from its iconographic representation, from its duty to represent kind of iconographic representations of the church. So here is this kind of these characters kind of set on this kind of humanistic horizon where there's no redemption, that that you have these figures hanging from trees, and that even in terms of the kind of slightly mimetic sort of association with the Holy Trinity, with the crucifixion, these figures hanging off the tree called great deeds against the dead, that they will only rot and putrefy and drop into the ground, and actually they're subjected to gravity in the soil rather than any kind of metaphysical redemption. So this work is kind of the most heretically kind of profound beginning of modernity, where you have the embodiment of doubt, which is a completely new sense, a new idea, a new sense in which the human is locked into some sort of, racked by self-torment, because there's no way out of this. The materiality of existence is just as it is. You live, you eat, and you shit, and you die, and there's no, and that's kind of, that's kind of a profound beginning. And so I guess that's why we went back to it, because it was like, right, this is where modernity begins, and this is where we can kind of somehow insert some kind of piece of, I don't know, maybe whether it's kind of genetic engineering with watercolor or glitter. Wow. Profoundly stupid.
Can I ask you, Jake? I have a question. One is a practical question. Do you own a set of Goya's disasters that you didn't paint on?
Wow. Do you know, I've never thought about that or been asked that. No.
Okay. I'm just curious. It's do you?
They don't survive, Massimiliano.
What?
They don't survive. If they arrive to Drake's hands, they don't survive.
And the second question is
really interesting.
It's interesting that you speak about doubt as let's say the modus operandi of modernity, but one could also argue that let's call it the vandalic act of attacking a work or finishing it, or there is this kind of paradox that you are also affirming that figure. It's the Pirandello, the Italian writer, would say that blasphemy activates the sacred. The moment you vandalize it, you're still also glorifying it, and so. And it takes some gut on your part, and it takes also it's some sort of perverse celebration of the integrity of that work. So I'm curious, it is doubt, but it's also extremely assertive, which is also, the other side of modernity, the side that maybe is also frightening that we know about. And I don't know if those thoughts.
No, I
had when you work on it.
I absolutely entirely agree with that. I think that's the thing is that it's not so much, it's not in any way ridiculing the work for being doubtful. It's a way of kind of almost sacralizing its doubt by saying, well, that you kind of it's not obliterating it in any sense. It's that almost through the performative act of drawing on the thing, that it's not so much what the thing looks like. It's just that the act of doing something to something has some kind of residual outcome in terms of just the notion that you've done that. But in some senses, I think it was Pierre Klosowski who says that transgression is an act that has to be. We act out transgression as if each transgression has not been acted before, so that you return to this sense in which it has this kind of value. But then once the transgressive act is acted, you have a moment of amnesia where you forget the act, so that the next time it happens, each time has the same valence, the same kind of intensification. You can think about kind of in terms of Christianity, the idea of the death of Christ. So I suppose in some ways it's kind of acting out some kind of ritualistic sort of form of revitalization, I guess. But I guess the idea of putting glitter on it kind of somehow undermines the integrity of that argument, because it's kind of you know, it also has a certain amount of ridiculousness to it. So it's not only just kind of going through the ritual processes of kind of, sort of, it's sort of an eroticization of violence in terms of Goya, but also there is a kind of a nagging kind of sarcasm, I guess, in there by using things like glitter.
There is within this, I mean, the conversation on bad manners, and I can say this also, a month and a half or 2 months into the show, that the questions that come up most often concern authorship, authority, ethical codes in the art world and outside of it, and so on. But it seems like there is a great interest actually within the artworks with questions that have to do maybe with a different notion of the term identity. So I was kind of curious because when Massimiliano said, you agreed to join us, I thought to myself, my God, I mean, you've had this experiment that you've run for a period. I'm not sure if experiment is the right term. You'll correct me, I'm sure. Where since the late 90s, you started in certain occasions to kind of suddenly stand in or kind of replace Maurizio Catalan in different interviews, conversations. Then even more recently, when Be Right Back, the documentary came out, I think there was kind of a big surprise to those who are within the art world to see your face instead of his in the narrative in a very kind of straightforward way. But I think what was particularly interesting in that was that the motivation for doing that isn't always entirely clear. And I'm curious to hear what was behind this.
Well, it's obviously I don't know if I can be objective about it because it was a big chunk of my life, and on many levels it was also a point of entry in a certain international art world, and that was one of the motivating factors. But so for those who don't know, I met Maurizio, I believe, in 97 or 98 when I was working at Flash Art, the magazine in Italy, and I was asked to interview him. And at the time, interviewing Maurizio, speaking of appropriation, was also a very painful process. He had one of these early laptops, I don't know what they were called back then, they open like that, and he had a file where he would transcribe answers by other artists that he was intrigued by and interested in. It was a never-ending Word document that ranged from, Yoko Ono, Francesco Clemente, maybe actually the Chapman brothers too, and, Warhol, et cetera, et cetera. And you would ask him a question and he would say, oh yeah, wait a minute. And he would scroll down and then recite somebody else's answer as a kind of ready-made. And he was, the answer was always somewhat pertinent, but also off, and it was a bit of a Brechtian estrangement. So we did this interview, which took hours because, to go through 10 questions, he had to read like 20 answers each and so on. And then he said, and we were having a good time, and we were in the library of Flash Art. Also, sometimes he would just take a book and say, oh, let's use this one. And then at the end of that, he said, oh, tomorrow I have to do this interview with the national radio in Italy. Would you want to do it? And I say, what do you mean? And he said, well, I'll give your phone number. At the time also, I don't think we had cell phones. And he said, I'll give you the phone number and I call you at 4 and you'll be live. And I said, okay. And we did it. And, at that moment, I just said, okay, because I think what Maurizio was doing seemed interesting to me in terms of renewing ideas around identity as a coherent construct that I wasn't interested in, and I was excited by this notion of a more exploded identity and a kind of interchangeable construction. And so I said, okay. Then I also thought, and this maybe I thought retrospectively, but as a curator, and particularly me growing up, my legendary models were, sorry, this sounds immodest, but, Breton, Zara, Marinetti, they were all the ones that were literally giving voice to the artist. No, they were the spoke. It wasn't just somebody who organizes the show, speaking actually of boundaries. They were the ones that were writing the manifestos and giving voice to the artist. And so I thought, if I have to be a spokesperson, it doesn't get much more speaking than actually being a kind of ventriloquizing critic or puppet. And I also have to say that after the first time, Maurizio would also pay me, and my salary was so meager that when I came to New York, particularly, that was a profession. And I also like this kind of complete violation of the presumed objectivity of the critic. The critic is meant to be at a distance, and it's meant to judge. So in a sense, maybe he has some similarities with what Jake has been doing to artworks. I was doing it to an artist and to certain myth of objectivity in the relationship between critic, artwork, and curator that I thought were also false. And so in a sense, I was confessing I was corrupted because I was paid by the artist and providing words for that. And it was also a way in which I got to know people and be introduced to people. I also upset some people. We did, the Venice Biennale just opened in 2001. I did an interview as Maurizio, this was pushing it a little, in front of Richard Serra's amazing installation, and speaking of the work as if it was mine. And then Richard Serra came and he sees me there and he says, "What do you think you're doing?" And I had to kind of, get myself out of that situation. And there were also embarrassing situations in which, journalists went back home with a video and showed it to their boss, and the boss for some reason knew Maurizio, and they were like, "That's not Maurizio, what's going on here?" And we had a couple of occasions in which we had to send letters, not of apologies, but of explaining that it was a project. And actually, we should have known better, because the first time I did it live, it was for NYU summer school at the Guggenheim in Venice, and a student just lost it, and she sent a letter complaining, saying that she wasn't paying tuition to be manipulated by a stand-in. So, I think for me, there was a sense of reinvention, also a kind of joy that anybody can be everybody. But of course, it's been also criticized as being manipulative and cynical, and it went much longer than I thought it would, because it started in 98. I think we stopped probably in 2006, because then we were also working on projects together. It was becoming a little schizophrenic to be myself and him. And then the movie was a surprise. The movie, I actually took some friends to see the premiere at the Guggenheim, and I was so embarrassed that I was featured. I sat through the interviews, but I didn't know it would be so much of my face. And that was a strange also reversal, because the whole idea was to kind of disperse identity, but as often, maybe also in the examples of, we were quoting earlier, the erasure mysteriously amplifies the entity, even the erasure of Goya still confirms Goya. So I think that's a paradox that I don't know if it's the paradox of modernity, but it's a big question. How can you be against something and not involuntarily actually confirming that's something you're against? And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, the blasphemy that actually activates the sacred, which is also, when Maurizio attacks the Pope, is ultimately probably a Christian piece more than a blasphemous piece.
Yeah. So it's interesting, because taking this back to the exhibition, one of the things that, again, when walking with somebody or talking about the show, or suddenly realize is to what extent actually artists have been happily complicit in most cases to the fact of their artwork being manipulated, even at the cost of their work, sometimes even when the cost is quite dear. Yet often when we see problems, it comes to other industries. So we see this both with people like Richard Prince, who re-photograph photographs that are used by, so advertisers or photographers who usually work not within the art world, but actually within the fashion industry or the advertising industry. We see this in several other industries. And it's also interesting because we often see this when we actually talk about reproducible objects rather than individual unique objects. But I'm curious because it was interesting that when we corresponded in a preparation for the conversation, both Massimiliano and Jake, you both kind of expressed your interest to talk about the crossover to other industries. So I wonder if either of you want to either share some examples of that happening, or maybe also propose if there is a unique nature to this gesture within the art world, the specific art world that we're talking about, that differs, for example, from the music industry or otherwise, or advertising.
Yeah, I think also it changes with the times, or also we had an experience again with Maurizio, not to mention him again, but one of his project was called Permanent Food, which is this magazine. He calls it a second generation magazine. It's a magazine made of pages stolen from other magazines, in which he would invite artists to contribute pages, and mainly the pages were torn from other magazines. And when we did the Berlin Biennale, we kind of created a sort of source book of all the artists we had looked at in the course of the research, and we did it with a similar approach by literally tearing out and reproducing. It was done in that case actually as a kind of xerocopy, and at the cost of sounding insensitive, we were very surprised because when we released the book, there was a fair number, not an astronomical number, of artists who felt that there was crossing a line, that they hadn't given permission, that there were issues of copyrights and ownership, and I don't, I thought, or I read it as maybe because it was in Germany, that was my reading, that maybe a certain notion of integrity was more respected, or these experiments in property as theft maybe work better in smaller communities of people that consider each other as peers. Obviously the Dadaists, they all did it, etc., etc. So I think it shifts, and right now, clearly also, when there is more money involved, when industries are bigger and also the art world is bigger, I think people tend maybe to get a bit more proprietary and territorial. I'm actually curious, Jake, has anybody done anything to your work similar to what you have done to other people's work, and has that felt differently?
Surprisingly little, actually. I kind of been sort of assuming it would happen, but it doesn't. I think it's, I kind of think it's from the point of view of things like copyright, considering our work, my work, I have no legs to stand on whatsoever. So if anyone did, what could I say? I could say nothing. And the point about the Goya things is that the Goya work is that the only way in order to make it more than just a gesture is to, we had a slush fund in which when we sold one set, we'd buy another set and keep going through. So rather than this being some kind of one-off transgressive act that could be just then reappropriated or recuperated just to the kind of antics of artists, we kind of said, well, we will just get every single one we can get until we actually get rid of all of them. So, rather than just the de Kooning erasure of one drawing, it would be like Rauschenberg getting every drawing of de Kooning and rubbing them all out. So it does become a little bit like it moves out of the symbolic into the actual practical. But I was thinking about this conversation I was thinking, if you think about sort of data, the idea about the kind of the provenance of sort of data is that statement, information wants to be free, and that in some senses the promise of digital technology and the digital world is that it has a kind of an egalitarian and a democratic sort of purview in terms of the fact that code is code. You can't patent code. But if you think about NFTs, the rise of NFTs off the back of COVID, which I think is kind of COVID is certainly symptomatic, given the fact that it's the only way you can buy art without having to touch it or breathe on a dealer, or collector. But I think in some senses what's interesting about the NFT in relation to information wants to be free is it's the one way in which you can make it information not free. What you do is you start to put some kind of scarcity value on one particular set of digital output, which completely sort of de-radicalizes the digital technology. I know, of course, that has some kind of, benefit for those making digital art and want, that need paying. But I suppose in some ways, the the idea of what's at stake in being the artist, what's at stake in this notion of saying, well, the artist wants to act in a spontaneous. I mean, I guess this is a kind of very conventional reading of what the artist is, but the artist wants to act spontaneously and express themselves within some kind of coherent manner, which is kind of analogous to being free. They want to sell the work, but they have to have a limit on the amount of work that they sell in order to not devalue their work. So we're talking about some kind of, some kind of infringement upon the kind of spontaneity sort of freedom model, because really what artists are, they're very aware of their value, and they're very aware of the productivity and the exchange rate of their works of art. So I suppose and in terms of the intellectual property of art history, at what point can any artist claim any sort of authorial right over any picture or anything that they can, even in the most literal sense? I guess I suppose that's my position anyway, is this idea of saying that there are no ideas which are not kind of always already there, that the ideas kind of are a priori to artists. Artists are just simply, I mean, you mentioned the echo, the machine. What was it? The lazy machine. Yeah. Well, there's a Samuel Butler, which when you mentioned that Samuel Butler in Erewhon wrote, he said that man, the industrial worker is just merely the machine tickling aphid. And I was kind of thinking that it would be kind of interesting to write the kind of history of art where you actually look at the artist as just being the kind of subservient, the kind of the janitor for the history of art, where merely all they are is art tickling aphids. So that you could write a history of art, completely exclude all the artists, and it would still be coherent, perhaps even more coherent.
Yeah, the Italian curator Achille Bonito-Oliva says the artist is the byproduct of the artwork, not the other way around. As a curator, it's always...
I think that's right.
But, speaking of, and we should go back to the question actually about the industries, but, what you were saying also about ownership made me think of, and you also have a couple of pieces by or about or through Duchamp, but, Duchamp apparently at the end of his career, he would sign anything. And I don't remember if it's in the Calvin Tompkins biography, but he says, I like to do it because it diminishes the value, no? And how incredible that he had set up a system signature, which should be the proof of authorship and the tool that bestows value on it. He was inflating it to the point that then he would actually reduce the value. And actually the piece you have, the mirror, no, is a classic example, because according to legend, he went to Milan to the Triennale and sees these pieces of glass as they were setting up the room, and he just signs it almost as you would sign a blank check. So this notion that the signature almost becomes a vandalic act is quite provocative, no? And the tool of ownership becomes actually a tool of inflation. But to return then to your question about the other industries, I think there are some, and maybe this is the time to show the video that
absolutely yes.
No, there are examples of artists who don't sit quietly with their work being appropriated, particularly by another industry, and particularly in the realm of advertisement.
Yeah, so I think exactly. I mean, Jake, you've recently made new work that kind of plays onto a work that's already been robbed once, and it was robbed not by an artist, but it was robbed by the advertising industry. I don't know if you want to say a word or two about it, or should I say, or should we show it?
I just want to put one little thing in here. It's the first time that I've ever sought permission, and that might be to do with the fact that most of the artists I work with are dead. But ask
most.
But most. So yes, no. I mean, I was kind of at pains to ask permission for this because of my respect for officially revised. So anyway, so you can introduce the work.
So
Better you do it.
This is really as recent as a work can get. We were preparing for the exhibition, and Jake was saying, "Hold on, I've got this work cooking. I just need a little bit more time." And we had a day to open the show, so it was really, I think it came into the point of us not knowing if it's going to come in or not. The weekend before the opening, Jake gives us a ring and says, "Okay, it's done. Get a monitor into the gallery. We're going to show it." And basically, it's Peter Fishley and David Weiss did this film called The Way Things Go in the 80s, which was one of their most kind of iconic pieces, and which they spent 6 months in the studio making a chain reaction movie. At some point, almost 26 years later, in the early 2000s, Honda comes up with a new advertisement for their cars, and they rip off the exact structure of the reaction film without any acknowledgement or asking for permissions, and which became a legal pursuit by the artists in this case. Jake decided to reunite the two films instead of calling them The Way Things Go. This film is called The Way Things Don't Go. And it's overlaid with a soundtrack from the film Groundhog Day. I won't say more. I'll just let us see it. And of course, it's available also in the exhibition to see much better.
Put your little hand in mine. There ain't no hill or mountain we can't climb. Babe, I got you, babe. I got you, babe.
Okay, campers, rise and shine, and don't forget your booties, 'cause it's cold out there.
It's cold out there every day. What is this, Miami Beach?
Not hardly. And you can expect hazardous travel later today with that blizzard.
Oh, that blizzard thing. That blizzard thing. Oh, well, here's the report. The National Weather Service is calling for a big blizzard thing.
Yes, they are. But there's another reason why today is especially exciting.
Especially cold.
Especially cold, okay. But the big question on everybody's lips.
Yeah, they're chap lips.
They're chap lips.
Damn right.
Do you think Phil's gonna come out and see a shadow?
Punxsutawney Phil.
That's right,
I got
Woodchuckers.
you,
It's
babe.
Groundhog Day. Get up and
I got you,
Okay, campers, rise and shine, and don't forget your booties, 'cause it's cold out there.
It's cold out there every day. What is this, Miami Beach?
Not hardly. And you can expect hazardous travel later today with that blizzard thing.
Oh, that blizzard thing. That blizzard thing. Oh, well, here's the report. The National Weather Service is calling for a big blizzard thing.
Yes, they are. But there's another reason why today is especially exciting.
Especially cold.
Especially cold, okay. But the big question on everybody's lips.
Yeah, they're chap lips.
On their chap lips. Right. Do you think Phil's gonna come out and see a shadow?
Punxsutawney Phil.
That's right, Woodchuckers. It's Groundhog Day! Get up and shake that hog out there! Yeah! Come here, Groundhog! Okay, campers, rise and shine, and don't forget your booties, 'cause it's cold out there.
It's cold out there every day. What is this, Miami Beach?
Not hardly. And you can expect hazardous travel later today with that blizzard.
Oh, that blizzard thing. That blizzard thing. Oh, well, here's the report. The National Weather Service is calling for a big blizzard thing.
Yes, they are. But there's another reason why today is especially
Especially cold.
Especially cold, okay. But the big question on everybody's lips.
Yeah, they're chap lips.
On their chap lips. Right. Do you think Phil's gonna come out and see a shadow?
Punxsutawney Phil.
That's right, Woodchuckers. It's Groundhog Day. Get up and shake that hog out there. Okay, campers, rise and shine. Don't forget your booties, rise and shine. And don't forget your booties, rise and shine.
Out there every day. It's cold.
Not hardly. And you can expect hard travel. And you can expect hard travel later today with that.
Oh, well, here's the report. The National Weather Service is calling for a National Weather Service is calling for the National Weather Service is calling for
the big question on everybody's Phil's gonna come out.
Punxsutawney Phil. Punxsutawney Phil.
That's right. Groundhog Day. Get up. Groundhog
Jake, how did you get hold of the footage of the Honda footage? Because I thought that was no longer.
It's all lo-fi. It's all YouTube, really.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Total theft.
Yeah.
I do want to ask. We're actually also approaching the end, and I wanted to ask you both something. I think throughout the process of preparing the show, Jake spoke a lot about, and you mentioned this this evening quite a bit, about the history of bad manners being somewhat implicit in the history of modern art. The idea and the gesture of taking someone else's creation in order to make progress or in order to examine where things are going onwards. Funnily enough, when we started looking for this history, we found it really rarely accepts physical manipulation. I'm going back to this because it seems to be at the heart of this gesture, because while you can find a hugely coherent and clear history of appropriation, for example, or very specific moments or movements that deal with the destruction of works that are not necessarily attributed to significant artists. You can think about kind of, modifications by situationists like Asger Jorn and Rico Bay, etc. These seem to be really, really few and far apart. On the one hand, it's really funny because, artists put everything in the gallery, but God forbid they lift a pencil and touch somebody else's artwork. And I wonder if there's any kind of looking at it from the opposite side of the court or opposite view. And I'm opening this to both of you. There's a kind of sanctity of the art object that still persists and still prevails clearly in the art world. And is that the way you both feel things are, and whether is that term still a relevant term to talk about, that kind of sanctity of the art object? Who am I asking? I don't know if this is entirely to you, Massimiliano.
I don't know if Jake qualifies for this.
No. So I leave it to you.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a matter of sanctity. I think sadly it's of yesterday the news now of a Jorn piece that was vandalized. And interestingly enough, it was also, I don't know much. I only read the news in our forum, but it had also to do with sort of confused free speech proclaims. I think we are also in an interesting moment in which, certain ideas of freedom are embraced by right-wing, incredibly conservative, I dare to say, thinkers. So there is that too that complicates matters, no? The notion that you can take what is not yours and use it, I think, paradoxically in this moment is maybe more in the province of conservative thought than in, let's say, progressive thought. And I mean, I also say this hesitantly because I don't want to judge art based on ethical codes, which I think is a question also that, let's say, the vandalic act poses, or I don't know if you want to call it vandalic act, but the actual act on an existing artwork poses, and that's also what fascinates me, the idea that the artwork might be beyond good and evil is not very popular at the moment, and maybe rightly so, but it's a very interesting question. Should we measure art by ethical standards, or large part of the avant-garde was based on the idea that ethical considerations don't apply to the avant-garde. The avant-garde won't give up. So I don't know. I think maybe the reason is that there is a feeling that even when you touch the artwork to deface it, you are somewhat recognizing its authority, and maybe that's why not many artists also do it. They feel it's maybe epigonic, no? Or ultimately also, can you sell it? Can you get your space into history with somebody else's work? I think, I'm surprised there is no actually Sturtevant in the show. Is there? There is Sherry Levine.
There isn't.
There's Sherry Levine, yeah.
There isn't. We've had a very strong and complicated discussion about certain artists and about their relationship to other artists and the way they position themselves. But Sturtevant is certainly a relevant.
With her, you have this interesting, even more than Levine, not that it's a deliberate position of epigonism, but that attains some kind of both critical rereading of the past and some sort of originality without changing anything. No, it's.
But do you think also that I was thinking that that somehow, again, back to this notion of modern art as kind of being kind of problematized by its own position, and so in some senses you can see that the modern artist as being the kind of the cultural revolution is still restrained by being complicit with economic forces which are kind of bourgeois, to be crude, but that in some senses the radicality of an artist is restrained by the sanctity that's put on work beyond their kind of claims about what they do. And I think this is kind of really exemplified if you think about someone like Gerhard Richter and the Red Brigade paintings, because what that kind of shows is this kind of romanticization of the Red Brigade that were active participants in acts of violence and kind of revolutionary activity by an artist who obviously that in some ways what it kind of represents is a kind of a sort of a yearning for activity which is constrained by the limits of making art, because what art can't do. I think someone like Mark Fisher was suggesting something about the idea of a kind of anti-capitalist movement operating within capital, so that we can have, what art does is it operates our self-loathing for us while we still participate in capital. So in a sense, maybe that's the thing, is the idea of sort of, if there's a sanctity to the work of art, that's almost the kind of the sort of the great accusation against the kind of radical possibility of artists, is that in the final instance they are reduced to the sanctity of its economic value and the economic system that they are kind of tied into. So this notion of radicality is always constrained by the fact that actually, even at its worst kind of abject kind of antics, its worst kind of deformations of liberal society. And actually what that does is it underscores the possibility and the tolerances of liberal society, so that rather than sort of don't bite the hand that feeds you, it literally offers you this kind of this permission to bite the hand that feeds you, because that's how liberal society kind of measures its tolerance. So maybe the sanctity of the work of art is not so much to do with some implicit, immanent sort of sacred meaning. It's just because, in the final instance, all artists who claim to be radical are just simply, in servitude to an economic system that they prefer to not really step outside of. I guess I would say, not we, I don't know.
No, that's a brilliant summary. And a brilliant place to say thank you.
I don't know if it's the best way. It's a really grim end.
Self-loathing. Let's see, capital.
Sorry.
Should we do? No, but honestly now, thank you both so much for a wonderful conversation and an opportunity to think about questions which, although sometimes seem kind of theoretical, are actually hugely important and seem to be really on topic right now. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening and waiting so patiently while we were trying our technical skills. Thank you. Good evening. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.